Today I'm going to tell you a story so haunting it lingers long after the last hoofbeat fades set deep in the unforgiving American West, where dust hangs in the air and silence often hides something dangerous. It's a place where justice and vengeance ride the same trail and where a single mistake can cost a life. It began with something small, a quiet morning, an empty corral, and the disappearance of one horse. But that missing horse would awaken a past that was never truly buried. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The sun was just cresting Coyote Ridge, spilling thin gold across the dry wash and the sagebrush that bordered Shadow Crest Ranch. Riley Kane stepped onto the porch in her usual rhythm, the same one she'd kept for 8 years, coffee first, then the corral, then the stable. The air carried the sharp bite of dust and creosote cool enough at this hour to make her breath fog for a moment before the day burned it away. She wore the plain cotton shirt and worn boots that had become her armor, nothing to mark her as anything more than a widow who kept horses and kept to herself. She crossed the packed earth boots, making soft thumps against ground, baked hard by summer after summer. The routine was her shield. As long as she moved the same way every morning, the past stayed buried under the floorboard where it belonged. Storm should have been waiting. The silver-dun mustang always lifted his head when she came near. Ears pricked a low nicker rolling out like a question. Today the corral was empty of sound. No breath, no hoof scrape, no restless shift of weight against the rails. Just silence, where there should have been life. Riley slowed. Her pulse didn't jump. It settled the way it used to when she read sign in places where one wrong step meant a bullet. She reached the stable door. The lock hung open chain, dangling the hasp, sliced clean through with something sharper than a ranch knife. Not broken in anger, cut with care. She knelt. Bootprints pressed the dirt inside 4 sets, deliberate, no scuff of hesitation. One pair heavier than the others, another limping slightly expensive stitching on the leather. Near the water trough, deep gouges showed where Storm had fought the lead rope hooves churning before they dragged him out. The mustang had not gone quietly. Riley's fingers hovered over the marks. She could have walked away then, could have saddled her spare mount, ridden into Copper Springs, told Wyatt Stone a horse was missing, and let the law handle it. Most widows would. Instead, she reached down and brushed away a thin layer of dust. A brass button lay half-buried, etched with a small, unmistakable scorpion curled around its own tail. Her breath caught not from surprise, but from recognition so old it felt like a bruise pressed fresh. Jace Calder. 8 years since Sycamore Canyon. 8 years since she'd tracked Boone Calder across 200 miles of badlands and delivered him to a judge who hanged him at sunrise. 8 years since Jace's men had waited in the rocks above the pass and turned a routine pursuit into an ambush that left Cole Harlan bleeding out in her arms while she tried to staunch the wound with shaking hands. She rose slowly, the button closed in her fist. The morning light caught the silver in her hair streaks. She no longer tried to hide. She walked back to the cabin without hurry, each step measured. Inside the 2-room space was dim and still. She knelt beside the bed, pried up the loose floorboard. The wooden box, weighted turquoise inlay dull with disuse. She lifted the lid. The Colt lay there, grips worn smooth by years of practice she no longer admitted to. Beside it, the brass spyglass, the leather-bound journal filled with notes in her own tight hand, and the silver star, not a local badge, but the federal marshal's mark she'd once worn without question. Beneath them folded once the yellowed wanted notice with her younger face staring back. Riley Kane, known as Shadowstep. She touched the star. Memories rose like dust under a hoof, Cale's voice teaching her to read, disturbed lichen on rock Cole's laugh, when she beat him to a trail's end, the crack of rifles in Sycamore Canyon, the wet heat of blood on her hands. She closed the box, slid the Colt into her waistband beneath the shirt, and dropped the scorpion button into her vest pocket. Outside again, she stood on the porch and looked east. The red-tailed hawk circled high above the ridge, patient, waiting. Riley's copper eyes followed it for a long moment. She could still pretend this was just another theft. She could still choose the quiet life she'd built here, brick by brick, grief by grief. But the silence from the stable had already answered for her. She stepped down off the porch and walked toward the corral post, where the rope marks still showed Mexican vaquero knots. Deliberate false signs swept east, while the real trail bent south. Her fingers traced the braided hemp. Then she looked south toward the Dragoon Mountains, blue and distant under the climbing sun. Jace Calder had not come for horses. He had come for her. The realization settled in her chest like lead heavy, but not surprising. She had hidden long enough. The past had found the scent and followed it home. Riley turned back to the cabin. There was coffee still warm on the stove. She poured a cup black and bitter and drank it standing at the window, watching the light stretch longer across the desert floor. Somewhere out there, Storm was moving under strange hands. Somewhere out there, Jace Calder thought he had the advantage. He was wrong. She set the empty cup down with a soft click. The sound was small final. The day had begun like any other. It would not end that way. The knock came soft but steady, the way a man knocks when he's not sure he wants to be heard. Riley set the empty cup down on the rough pine table and crossed the cabin floor in 3 measured steps. She paused at the door, hand resting on the Colt hidden under her shirt. The metal was cool against her skin, a reminder she didn't need. She opened the door just wide enough. Luke Tanner stood on the porch, hat in both hands, young face earnest under the brim. Dust clung to his boots and the cuffs of his trousers. Behind him, the morning had already turned hot, the air shimmering off the hardpack. "Mrs. Kane," he said, at voice low. "Morning. I didn't mean to disturb you so early." "You're not disturbing, Riley," answered, stepping aside. "Come in. Coffee's still hot." He hesitated, then ducked inside. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and sage she'd hung to dry. Luke's eyes flicked around, quick, polite, but taking note the single chair, the narrow bed, the mantel bare, except for a small, carved wooden horse Cole had whittled years ago. Nothing to betray her. She poured him a tin cup, black, no sugar. He took it with a nod. "Wyatt sent me," he began. "The Calderwood place was hit last night. 3/4 horses gone, good ones. The Dunn brothers lost 2 from the north pasture. Same as yours. Clean-cut fences, no tracks worth a damn in this dry ground." Riley leaned against the table, arms folded. She kept her face still. "Organized," she said quietly. Luke nodded. "Looks that way. Wyatt's putting together a posse this afternoon. Thought you might want to ride in, take a look. You know these hills better than most." She felt the weight of his gaze, curious, not suspicious, but close enough to make her skin prickle. He was young, 24, maybe still wearing the earnestness of a man who believed the law could fix most things. She had been that young once. "I'll think on it," she said. Luke sipped the coffee, winced at the bitterness, then set the cup down. "Your mustang Storm, right silver done. He's a beauty. Sorry he's gone. Must sting." The words landed soft, but they cut. Riley looked past him to the open door, where the corral rails stood empty against the sky. "It does," she said. He shifted his weight. "You notice anything unusual when you found the stable? Anything at all?" She could have lied. Could have said no, poured him more coffee, sent him on his way. But the boot prints were still fresh in her mind. Those expensive heels, the limp in one gait, the careful sweep of false trail east, while the real path bent south toward the dragoons. She knew the pattern. She had drawn it herself years ago in a journal now locked away. Fence was cut with wire cutters, she said at last. Not the cheap kind locals carry, Mexican vaquero style. And they laid a false trail east. Horses went south. Luke's eyebrows lifted. He studied her a moment longer than necessary. That's sharp, he said. Most folks wouldn't see that. Riley shrugged the motion small. I watch my stock. You learn. He nodded slowly, but the curiosity didn't leave his eyes. She felt the shift the moment when a simple visit turned into something else. He was marking her now, not as a victim, but as someone who knew more than she let on. That was dangerous in its own quiet way. I'll tell Wyatt, he said. He'll want to hear it at the meeting. Town Hall noon. You coming? She met his gaze. I'll see. Luke touched the brim of his hat. Appreciate the coffee, ma'am. He stepped out into the heat. She watched him mount up the horse, snorting dust, then watched until the dust trail thinned and vanished toward Copper Springs. The cabin felt smaller after he left. Riley crossed to the bed, knelt and lifted the floorboard again. This time she didn't hesitate. She reached past the Colt and the star fingers, finding the small beaded leather pouch, Kale's gift, soft with age, smelling faintly of cedar smoke and desert herbs. Inside lay owl feathers, a few dried roots, the talismans he'd taught her to carry when the land itself turned against you. She slipped the pouch into her vest pocket next to the scorpion button. The weight was familiar grounding. She stood at the window again. The sun had climbed higher, bleaching the ridge white. South, the dragoons rose dark and jagged hiding canyons, where a man could lose himself for weeks. Jace Calder knew those canyons. He knew she did too. He hadn't come for random horses. He had come because 8 years ago she had taken his brother to the gallows and the debt had never been settled. Now he had found her quiet widow horse trainer nobody, and he had taken Storm to draw her out. Riley's hand closed around the pouch. Fear moved through her, cold and familiar, the same fear that had woken her sweating in the nights after Sycamore Canyon. She could still stay. Could saddle the spare gelding ride to town, tell Wyatt everything she knew, let the posse chase shadows, while she waited here safe behind the lies she had built. But the silence from the stable lingered in her ears. Storm had fought. She could still see the gouges in the dirt, the way he had resisted every step. She looked down at her hands, calloused, steady but trembling just enough to notice. The choice wasn't loud. It was quiet, like the moment before a trigger breaks. She turned from the window and began to gather what she would need. Outside, the red-tailed hawk cried once sharp and high, circling lower now. It had scented something on the wind. The town hall in Copper Springs smelled of old pine and tobacco smoke, the kind that had soaked into the walls over decades of hard meetings and harder winters. Afternoon light slanted through the high windows, cutting dusty beams across the rows of mismatched chairs, where ranchers sat shoulder to shoulder. Grant Harlan in the front row, broad and red-faced, the Dunn brothers leaning against the back wall with arms folded, faces tight. The murmur of low voices filled the room like distant thunder, uneasy waiting. Riley slipped in last, taking a place against the far wall near the door. She kept her hat low, hands loose at her sides. No one stared long. They were too busy with their own anger. 11 horses gone in one night. That wasn't just loss, it was a blade held to every throat in the valley. Wyatt Stone stood at the front, weathered hat, pushed back voice, carrying without shouting. Folks, settle. We've got a problem, but yelling won't bring the stock back. I'm riding out this afternoon with whoever's willing. We'll track what we can. Grant Harlan rose halfway from his chair. 12 hours head start, Wyatt. Dry ground. No rain in weeks. We'll be chasing ghosts. Wyatt's eyes narrowed. You got a better idea, telegraph Tucson. Bring real trackers. Grant's voice carried the weight of a man who owned the biggest spread in the county. That'll take days, Wyatt shot back. By then those horses are across the line or scattered in the mountains. The room stirred. Riley felt the shift in the air, the way fear turned to frustration, and then to something sharper. She kept her gaze on the big territory map nailed to the wall behind Wyatt. Faded ink, curled edges, lines she knew by heart. Luke Tanner, standing beside Wyatt with a battered ledger, glanced her way. Mrs. Kane noticed the theft first. You see anything unusual, heads turned. A few men frowned, woman in a room like this speaking up. Riley straightened slowly. She could stay silent, could let them ride out blind and come back empty-handed. But the valley was bleeding now, and silence would only deepen the wound. She stepped forward, boots quiet on the plank floor. The fence at my place was cut with Mexican wire cutters, not the kind rustlers usually carry. And they laid a false trail east toward Diamondback Pass. Horses went south, a ripple of murmurs. Grant Harlan turned fully in his seat. How in hell would you know that my late husband traded with vaqueros from Sonora? She said evenly. I know the pattern. She pulled the small notebook from her vest pocket, the one she'd carried for years before she buried it, and opened it to a page with precise sketches, horseshoe impressions, depth of strike wear on the right front hoof. She held it up so the men could see. One of their mounts has a custom shoe, she continued. Unusual wear sinks deeper on the southern trail. They tried to hide it under brush, but the mark's there if you look. The room went quiet. Men leaned closer, skepticism giving way to something uneasy. Wyatt studied her eyes, narrowing like he was seeing someone he'd heard of in old dispatches. You remind me of a story I heard once, he said slowly. Federal marshals used to talk about a woman who could track a ghost across bare rock. They called her Shadowstep. Riley met his gaze without flinching. Sounds like campfire talk, Marshal. Maybe. Wyatt paused. But I'd be a fool to ignore good information, no matter where it comes from. Mrs. Kane minds showing us on the map. She moved to the front, took the pencil Luke offered. Her hand was steady as she traced faint lines, game paths, water sources, choke points. They'll avoid the main trails. Can't push 11 horses through tight canyons. They'll use these paths here. They'll need water by midday in this heat. Sidewinder Creek's the likely stop. The men crowded in. Luke spoke quietly beside her. That's solid. It's just observation, she said. But her voice carried the weight of something older. As the meeting broke into preparations, Nora Vale caught Riley's arm and drew her into the small kitchen off the main hall. The doctor's face was calm, but her eyes were sharp. You're going after them alone, aren't you? Nora asked. Riley didn't answer right away. The room smelled of coffee and lye soap, safe smells that didn't belong in what was coming. Nora stepped closer. These aren't desperate thieves, Riley. They kill without hesitation. I know the risks. This isn't only about the horse. Nora's voice softened. I've seen that look before. When you're on a trail, you change, like you're finally letting yourself be who you really are. Riley looked at her friend. Really looked. Nora had treated the old wound in her right shoulder 2 winters back, never asking how the bullet got there. She'd kept quiet, even when the pain flared, and Riley woke gasping in the night. 8 years is a long time to bury part of yourself, Riley said quietly. Nora rested a hand on her arm. Sycamore Canyon. Army doctors' talk reached Fort Bowie. A female marshal with a shoulder wound. She disappeared after. I never asked your name, but I know a bullet scar when I see one. Riley stiffened, then let out a slow breath. Being seen felt like a weight lifted, and another set down at the same time. Cole Harlan died because of my overconfidence, she said. I led him straight into it. I swore I'd never put anyone else at risk again. Nora's grip tightened. Then let me help you prepare. That shoulder's going to ache in the cold, and a storm's coming south. Riley hesitated, then nodded. I'll stop by your office before I leave. And Nora, not a word. Nora agreed, but added softly, Wyatt's already putting pieces together. He might not let it stay buried. Outside the hall, emptied slowly. Men checked rifles, argued routes. Riley stood in the doorway, watching them scatter into the heat. The valley was stirring now, and her silence had cracked just enough to let the past leak through. She felt Nora's hand on her shoulder one last time. Then the doctor walked away toward her clinic. Riley looked south again toward the dragoons. The sky was still clear, but a faint haze gathered on the horizon, dust or storm, hard to tell. The posse would ride tomorrow and lose the trail. She would not. Her fingers brushed the beaded pouch in her pocket. Somewhere out there, Storm was moving under strange hands, and the valley was watching her now, not as a widow, but as something else. The weight of eyes lingered on her back as she stepped into the street. She did not look behind her. The storm rolled in from the south like a slow freight train, black clouds boiling low over Rattlesnake Ridge. Thunder growled deep in the earth, and the first fat drops hit the dust with soft explosions, turning the ground slick and dark. Riley Kane moved through the scrub on foot, the borrowed bay gelding tied well back where the brush thickened. She had left the main trail hours ago, circling wide on a game path only jackrabbits and ghosts used. The wind carried the sharp scent of wet creosote and ozone, stinging her eyes. She had tracked the two men since dawn, Rafe Holt and Silas Crow, by the broken spider webs, still trembling the faint compression of soil under loose pebbles, the way disturbed lichen stained bare rock a different shade. They waited now at the narrow choke between two massive boulders, rifles ready expecting pursuit from the east. Their mistake. They had left their western flank open. Riley crouched behind a cluster of scrub oak Colt in hand, the familiar weight steadying her breathing. Rain began in earnest sheets of it, slashing sideways, drumming on her hat brim. Visibility dropped to yards. She waited. Not for courage, she had none left to summon, but for the moment when patience became necessity. Thunder cracked overhead. Lightning bleached the ridge white for an instant. In that flash, she saw them clearly, Rafe restless, checking a pocket watch again and again. Silas disciplined, but favoring his right side, an old injury she remembered from wanted sketches years back. She eased the wooden tube from Cale's pouch, the pronghorn call etched and worn. She raised it to her lips and blew once a raw, desperate bleat of a wounded animal carried on the wind. 5 minutes passed. She sounded it again, sharper, more urgent. Through the rain, she watched them stir. Words exchanged too low to hear. Fresh meat was tempting. Rafe shouldered his rifle and moved toward the sound. Silas stayed put eyes on the eastern approach. Riley circled through the brush silent as she had been taught. Rafe passed within 10 feet, boots crunching wet gravel. She stepped out behind him, Colt leveled at the center of his back. "Don't move," she said, voice low under the rain. "And don't call out unless you want this to end badly." Rafe froze. She could almost hear the calculation behind his eyes turn draw die. "That would be unwise," she added calmly. "Who the hell are you?" His voice was tight fear bleeding through the bravado. "The owner of the silver dun your boss stole." He swallowed. "Lower the rifle slow." He obeyed inch by inch. When he started to turn, she snapped eyes forward. "I have questions. You don't know who you're dealing with," he muttered. "Jace Calder. Second is Mateo Reyes. Tano, the Navajo scout. You and Silas Crow." She watched his shoulders sag. "Did I miss anyone?" Thunder rolled closer. Rafe's partner couldn't hear them now. "Where are the horses going, Dead Man's Pass?" he said at last. "Old Spanish mission at the north end." "But it won't matter. Jace is expecting pursuit. After the pass, Mexico. Horse trader named Ramon. Pays cash, no questions." Riley matched the route in her mind. Remote trails, quiet border crossing. Made sense. How many runs has Calder made? This is the 7th this season. Never hits the same place twice. Plans everything. Knows every escape from his smuggling days. She let that settle. One last question. Did Calder ever mention Sycamore Canyon? A marshal he ambushed, Rafe, stiffened. "I don't know what you're talking about." The answer rang true. The younger ones didn't carry that history. A sharp signal whistle cut the rain. Silas checking on Rafe's absence. Riley pressed the barrel gently between his shoulder blades. "We're going to meet your friend. Walk ahead. Hands where I can see them. Try to warn him, and this ends differently. You can't take both of us. I tracked 5 experienced men through terrain they thought erased. 2 won't be a problem." She bound his wrists with a leather thong from her belt, took his rifle, and pushed him forward into the clearing. Silas rose at once when he saw Rafe. Rafe relief crossed his face, then vanished. His eyes locked on the bound wrists, the gray-haired woman behind, with a Colt steady. Instinct took over. His hand dropped toward his holster. "I wouldn't," Riley said evenly. "Your partner's standing right in your line of fire. I don't have that problem." Silas froze. Rain hammered down harder, turning dust to slick mud. "Calder doesn't forget people who cross him," Silas warned. "Neither do I." The words hung. Something in her tone shifted the balance. Rafe dropped to his knees, trying to disappear. "Silas, don't be stupid. She could have killed us already." Riley used the distraction to shift laterally, keeping aim while gaining cover. Lightning split the sky again. In that frozen instant, she saw Silas trying to circle behind scrub oak. Her next shot splintered the branch beside his head. "This ends 2 ways," she called through the downpour. "You surrender and live, or you keep going, and I prove my reputation wasn't exaggerated." "What reputation?" Silas yelled back. Before she answered, Rafe called from the ground, panic clear. "Silas, I think she's that marshal. The one Boone talked about before he went down. The Shadow." The word hung in the rain-soaked air. For several heartbeats, only the storm spoke. Then slowly, Silas's pistol slid across the mud toward her. "I surrender, ma'am," he said, rising with hands visible. "If you're who he says, only a fool keeps fighting." Riley stepped forward, rain streaming off her hat, Colt never wavering. She bound Silas next, collected their weapons, and stood over them in the clearing. The storm pressed in thunder, shaking the ground. She had shown her face. The shots had been fired. Jace Calder might hear them, might turn back, might prepare. There was no more pretending to be the quiet widow who waited at home. She looked south toward the dark line of the dragoons, where Devil's Playground waited twisted canyons, hidden springs, places a man could vanish or die trying. Storm was in there somewhere. So was Jace Calder. Riley holstered the Colt, the metal warm now from her grip. She glanced once at the bound men, then at the storm-black sky. The old life had found her, and it wasn't letting go. The storm had passed by the time Riley reached the edge of Devil's Playground, but the air still hung heavy with wet earth and the faint metallic bite of ozone. Dawn bled pale across the eastern sky, turning the twisted canyons into long shadows and sharp edges of red rock. The maze stretched south toward the border, a labyrinth of narrow cuts, hidden springs, and sheer walls that swallowed sound and light alike. She had left the Bay Gelding tied in a sheltered hollow miles back. From here she moved on foot, lighter, quieter, harder to see. The ground told its story in small, brutal pieces. A crushed, prickly pear pad, too fresh for the sun to have dried the pulp. A stone shifted from its bed underside, still damp. Most telling a partial hoofprint, sheltered under an overhang custom shoe right front. And the same wear she had sketched in her notebook at the town hall. Tano's mount. Jace Calder was keeping the scout's horse unshod to hide the trail, but he couldn't hide everything. Riley paused, crouched low against the canyon wall. Her right shoulder throbbed in time with her heartbeat, the old wound flaring under the damp cold, a dull fire she hadn't felt this sharp in years. She pressed her palm against it, willing the ache to steady. It didn't. She had come this far alone because the posse would follow the obvious routes and lose the scent in the first narrow wash. She had come because Storm was in these canyons, somewhere tired and scared, under strange hands. She had come because if she turned back now, the valley would bleed out slowly, Grant Harlan's quarter horses gone. The Dunn brothers' stock scattered or sold, the small ranches folding one by one, until Copper Springs was just another ghost town on the maps. The thought settled in her gut like lead. She had spent 8 years trying to keep the world's weight off her shoulders. Now it pressed anyway. She eased forward, Winchester across her back, Colt loose in her hand. The passage narrowed, walls closing until she could almost touch both sides. A lizard darted across the rock faster than caution alone explained. Something had startled it recently. Riley flattened against the stone, breath shallow. Seconds stretched. A faint metallic scrape spur on rock, then silence. Someone was close. She mapped the canyon in her mind, and this cut opened into a small box canyon with a seasonal spring, one of the few reliable water sources before the border. A perfect place to rest horses before the final push south. Moving with glacial care, she edged toward a narrow fissure she remembered from years ago, a crack barely wide enough for a body angling up toward the rim. She slid off her gun belt, pushed it ahead, then followed. Rock tore at her shoulders and forearms, scraping skin through buckskin. She locked hands and boots in opposing pressure and climbed inch by inch, breath hissing between clenched teeth. 15 punishing minutes later, she reached a narrow ledge. She eased her head over the rim. Below, 3 horses stood picketed near the spring. Tano's paint, Mateo Reyes's sorrel, and apart from them, silver catching the weak light, Storm. The Mustang's head hung low, flanks streaked with dried sweat fatigue etched into every line of him. He looked unharmed, but the sight twisted something deep in Riley's chest. Only 2 men were visible. Tano crouched by a small, nearly smokeless fire, feeding it twigs. Mateo checked saddle gear nearby. Jace Calder was nowhere in sight. The absence tightened her focus like a noose. He wasn't the type to leave men behind without reason. Scouting ahead, perhaps, or closer than she thought. She weighed her position, outnumbered but not as badly as it could have been. The safe choice was to wait. Let Wyatt's posse find the mission empty, widen their search. But time would carry Storm across the line to Ramon's corrals, and the valley would pay the price in broken ranches and empty pastures. The thought of Grant Harlan watching his best bloodlines sold off the Dunn brothers selling land to survive the small outfits folding. It wasn't abstract anymore. It was real and it would happen if she hesitated. Riley eased back from the ledge, retrieved her gun belt, and began working along the rim toward the game trail on the far side. The footing was treacherous, loose stone, ready to slide, scrub offering little grip, the midday sun turning rock into a furnace under her boots. Sweat stung the scrapes on her arms. She had almost reached a better vantage when a faint scrape sounded behind her. Instinct dropped her flat. A bullet tore through the air where her head had been a heartbeat earlier, cracking stone and whining off into the canyon. Impressive reflexes for a woman your age, Jace Calder's voice carried from behind a boulder 20 yards back. But your reputation always did say you were exceptional, Marshal Kane. Riley rolled into the shelter of a shallow depression, measuring angles and distance in a single breath. He had anticipated her move to high ground. Tano must have picked up signs she thought she'd erased. She pressed her back to the rock Colt, ready breathing slow. The canyon twisted sound, making his voice echo from where he no longer stood. "It's been a long time, Calder," she called back, keeping her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. 8 years since Sycamore Canyon. A low chuckle drifted across the stone. "So you remember our little meeting? I wasn't sure. That bullet should have finished you." "You were never a good shot under pressure," she replied, using the exchange to mask her slow shift toward better cover. "Runs in the family," he said. His next shot came fast and sloppy, shattering rocks short of her position. Riley's jaw tightened. She had reached a cluster of boulders that offered real protection. She risked a quick look, caught sight of him shifting, circling to flank. "You killed my husband," she said quietly. Silence followed. When he spoke again, the tone had softened, almost reflective. It wasn't personal. He was in the way. "You were the prize, the Shadowstep, who never lost a trail." Stones scraped as he moved again. "You know what I learned after Sycamore," he continued. "We're not so different. Both building something from nothing. Both willing to do what it takes. There's a difference between justice and murder." "Is there?" His voice sharpened. "Looks like vengeance brought you here, not justice." Riley tracked the sound, adjusting her aim. He was talking too much, trying to justify himself, buying time. "One last question," she called, "setting the trap. Why keep the scorpion buttons? Not exactly subtle for a man trying to disappear." The hesitation told her everything. "Some things you don't walk away from, Marshal," he said finally. "Some marks become part of you." "I think you understand that." "I do," Riley answered, and fired. The shot struck not him, but the fractured rock beside him. Stone exploded downward in a sudden cascade, forcing him to lunge from cover. As he moved, she had her opening. She took it. Jace Calder screamed as the bullet tore into his shoulder, the impact spinning him off balance. His boots skidded on loose rock. For a suspended instant, he teetered on the rim. Their eyes locked, hers cold and steady, his wide with shock. Then he vanished over the edge. The crash echoed through the canyon, followed by shouts below as Tano and Mateo reacted to their leader's fall. Riley stepped to the rim, Winchester ready, the barrel still warm against her palm. Below, Jace lay sprawled on a rock shelf 30 feet down, alive but broken. His men scrambled toward him, weapons drawn, then looked up, searching for the shooter. "Next one goes center mass," Riley called down, rifle trained on Mateo. "Drop the guns and step away from him." The two men exchanged a hard look. With their leader down and death above them, choices were few. Slowly, both set their weapons on the ground. Riley exhaled once the sound small in the sudden quiet. The valley was safe now, or would be, if she could finish this. But the cost had already begun to mount. She felt the tremor in her hands, the ache in her shoulders spreading like slow poison. And somewhere in the rocks behind her, the faint scrape of a boot on stone told her the fight wasn't over yet. The canyon rim was a narrow knife edge of rock, wind-scoured and hot under the climbing sun. Riley Kane crouched behind a cluster of boulders, Winchester steady against her shoulder, the barrel still warm from the shot that had spun Jace Calder off balance. Below, he lay sprawled on a jagged shelf 30 feet down, blood already darkening the sleeve of his shirt where her bullet had torn through muscle. His breathing came in ragged gasps, audible even over the faint rattle of loose stones shifting under Tano and Mateo as they scrambled toward him. Riley's right shoulder burned old scar tissue protesting every heartbeat and the flare-up deeper now, spreading like slow fire into her arm. She shifted weight to her left side, trying to ease the pain without losing her sight picture. The canyon smelled of gunpowder hot stone and the faint copper tang of blood on the wind. Jace pushed himself up on one elbow, face twisted in pain and something darker recognition. He looked up at her eyes, narrowed against the glare. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," he rasped. "This isn't over." Riley kept the rifle trained on his chest. "It ended the moment you took my horse. You just didn't know it yet." A low, wet laugh escaped him, cut short by a cough. "My brother died because of you. Boone. You tracked him like he was nothing. Delivered him to hang like a dog. He robbed the Tucson stage," she said quietly. "Murdered the guard. Same way you chose to steal what wasn't yours." Jace's mouth twisted. "Justice, is that what you call it? Or just the same blood on your hands?" Riley felt the words land heavy and familiar. She had asked herself the same question on too many nights when sleep wouldn't come. Below, Tano and Mateo froze hands, half raised, waiting for her next move. Storm shifted uneasily at his picket near the spring ears, flicking toward the voices. Jace coughed again, and blood flecking his lips. "You know why I kept the scorpion buttons? Not pride, not stupidity. Some marks you don't walk away from, Marshal. They become part of you." He met her gaze. "I think you understand that." The words hung between them like smoke. Riley's finger rested light on the trigger guard. She could end it now, one clean-shot vengeance for Cole Harlan, for the years of silence she had carried like a wound. No one would question it. The canyon would swallow the echo, and the past would finally close. But the thought twisted in her gut. If she pulled the trigger here alone, she would be no different from the men she had once hunted. Shadowstep would win, and Riley Kane, the woman who had built a life at Shadow Crest, who had gentled horses and kept her word, would disappear forever. She exhaled once slow. "You're right," she said. "I do understand?" Jace's eyes widened a fraction, surprise, maybe hope. Riley shifted her aim slightly left. She fired. The bullet struck the fractured rock beside Jace's head, not flesh. Stone exploded in a sudden cascade, shards raining down. Jace lunged instinctively away from the falling rock boots skidding on the narrow shelf. For a heartbeat, he teetered arms, windmilling eyes locked on hers, shock then resignation. Then he fell. The impact was dull, meaty bone against stone. He landed hard on the lower ledge body, crumpling, still breathing, but broken. A low groan escaped him. Tano and Mateo reacted instantly, hands dropping toward dropped weapons. "Next one goes center mass," Riley called down, voice carrying clear over the canyon. "Drop the guns. Step away from him. Hands where I can see them." The two men looked up then at each other. Jace lay unmoving now, blood pooling under his shoulder. With their leader down and a rifle above them, the math was simple. Slowly, both set their pistols on the ground and backed toward the springbacks to the rock wall. Riley lowered the Winchester a fraction breath, coming in shallow pulls. The canyon fell quiet, except for the distant call of a raven circling high overhead. She had not killed him. Not directly. But the choice had cost her something anyway. The clean break she had hoped for, the chance to bury Shadowstep again and walk away unmarked. Below, Jace stirred weakly, one hand pressing the wound. He looked up at her mouth, moving words too faint to carry. She didn't answer. Instead, she began the careful descent along a goat trail she had spotted earlier, boots testing each step on loose scree. Her shoulder protested every movement, a deep, grinding ache that made her vision blur at the edges. She ignored it. There was no room for weakness now. When she reached the canyon floor, Tano and Mateo stood motionless, hands raised. Storm lifted his head at her approach, ears pricked forward in recognition. The mustang nickered once low and questioning the sound, cutting through the silence like a knife. Riley stepped to him first. She ran her hand along his neck, feeling the familiar heat of him, the faint tremor of exhaustion. "Easy, boy," she murmured. "We're going home." Storm pressed his muzzle against her chest, a simple gesture of trust that nearly undid her. Behind her, Jace groaned again. Tano watched her with wary respect. Mateo's eyes flicked toward the north entrance of the box canyon. Then she heard it, distant but unmistakable, the thunder of hoofbeats rolling toward the canyon mouth. Multiple riders moving fast. Wyatt Stone had not waited for dawn. Riley straightened Winchester, coming back to her shoulder. She glanced once at Jace, then at the two men still standing against the rock. The posse was coming. And whatever came next, there would be no more hiding. The raven called again, closer now, circling lower over the canyon rim. Riley stood in the open rifle, steady, the weight of eyes, old and new, settling on her like dust after a long ride. She did not move. The box canyon lay open below, like a wound in the earth walls, rising sheer and red under the midday sun. Riley Kane stood on the narrow ledge, Winchester steady the barrel, tracking Jace Calder's every shift. The air tasted of dust and gun smoke, sharp enough to cut the back of her throat. Her right shoulder throbbed in steady pulses, the old scar from Sycamore Canyon, protesting every heartbeat, the pain, deeper now, spreading into her arm like slow poison. She shifted her weight to the left, trying to ease it, but the rifle stayed level. Jace crouched behind fractured rock 20 yards back, blood already soaking his shirt where her first bullet had grazed muscle. He fired once wild, the shot cracking high and wide, kicking stone shards into the air near her head. The report echoed off the walls, ringing in her ears long after the bullet spent itself. Riley didn't flinch. She had heard worse. She had felt worse. She exhaled once slow and shifted her aim left. The second shot struck the fractured boulder beside him, not flesh. Stone exploded in a sharp cascade, chunks tumbling down the slope in a sudden roar. Jace lunged away from the falling rock boot, skidding on the narrow shelf. For a suspended instant, he teetered, arms, windmilling eyes locked on hers, shock. Then something quieter, almost resigned. "We're not so different," he said, voice carrying clear across the canyon before the fall took him. "Both building something from nothing. Both willing to do what it takes." The words landed like a stone in still water. Riley felt them ripple through her, the truth in them, the lie beneath. Then he was gone over the edge. The impact came dull and heavy bone against rock 30 feet below. A low groan escaped him, cut short. He lay sprawled on the lower shelf, breathing shallow blood, pooling dark under his shoulder. Tano and Mateo reacted instantly, hands dropping toward dropped weapons. "Drop the guns," Riley called down, voice carrying without shout. "Step away from him. Hands where I can see them." The two men looked up then at Jace's unmoving form. With their leader broken and a rifle above them, the math was simple. Pistols hit the ground, one after another. They backed toward the spring backs to the rock hands raised. Riley lowered the Winchester a fraction. The canyon fell quiet, except for the faint drip of water from the spring and Jace's ragged breathing. She began the descent along the goat trail boots, testing each step on loose scree. Her shoulders screamed, with every movement forcing her to favor her left arm and the rifle awkward now in the crook of her elbow. Sweat stung the scrapes on her forearms from the Fisher climb. She ignored it. There was no room for anything else. When she reached the floor, Tano and Mateo stood motionless. Storm lifted his head at her approach, ears pricked forward. The Mustang nickered once low and questioning, then stepped as far as the picket line allowed, muzzle reaching toward her. Riley crossed to him first. She ran her hand along his neck, feeling the heat of him and the faint tremor of exhaustion. "We're going home, boy," she whispered. Storm pressed his muzzle against her chest, a simple gesture of trust that nearly undid her. For a moment, she closed her eyes, breathing him in the familiar scent of dust and horse and freedom she had almost lost. Behind her, Jace stirred weakly. "You should have finished it," he rasped. Riley turned. She met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not you." Then she heard a distant thunder of hoofbeats rolling toward the canyon mouth. Multiple riders moving fast. Wyatt Stone had not waited for dawn. The posse burst into view at the north entrance. Wyatt in the lead, Luke Tanner beside him, Grant Harlan and half a dozen others fanning out behind. They rained up hard dust, boiling around the horses' legs. Wyatt's eyes swept the scene, two men against the rock with hands raised, Jace sprawled broken on the shelf, Riley standing in the open with Winchester across her arm, Storm at her side. "Well, I'll be damned," Wyatt said, voice carrying across the canyon. He dismounted slowly, hand resting on his holster, but not drawing. "Looks like Mrs. Kane didn't feel like waiting on us." Luke stared wide-eyed. "She's got Calder. And the whole outfit." Wyatt raised his voice. "Grant, take 4 men and secure the 2 by the spring. The rest perimeter. No surprises." As the posse fanned out, Wyatt stepped farther in, looking up to where Riley had held the high ground, moments before, then back to her on the floor. "You've made quite a mess of things, Mrs. Kane," he said, admiration edging the words despite the tone. "Care to explain why you're operating outside my jurisdiction with 3 wanted men at gunpoint recovering stolen property?" She answered, gesturing toward Storm. "Figured I'd save you the trouble." Wyatt chuckled despite himself. "Mighty neighborly." He nodded toward Jace, now being reached by 2 men climbing the slope. "He'll need a doctor. Bullet in the shoulder and a fall. Not fatal, though I suspect he wishes it were." Riley watched them haul Jace down, his face twisted in pain, eyes still burning as they dragged him past her. "You should have killed me," he spat through clenched teeth. She met his gaze without flinching. "It ended the moment you took my horse." When the prisoners were bound and guarded, Riley finally turned back to Storm. The Mustang stood calm now, head low, accepting her touch. She rested her forehead against his neck for a long moment, breathing him in, letting the ache in her shoulder match the ache in her chest. Wyatt came to stand beside her. He'll hang for what he did at Calderwood's, murdered a ranch hand during the theft. Riley's face gave nothing away. Inside, she felt no joy, only a quiet settling. Justice would be done, but the cost had mounted the shoulder that would never heal, clean the name Shadowstep, now spoken aloud before witnesses, the quiet life at Shadow Crest forever altered. Wyatt studied her a moment longer. "There's something you should know before we take them back." He drew a folded document from his pocket, yellowed, bearing a clear seal. "I've been carrying this for 8 years," he said. "A federal judge asked me to deliver it if I ever crossed paths with a missing marshal. You never resigned. You just vanished after that shoulder wound." Riley stared at the paper as recognition settled in. "That's a reactivation order," she said quietly. Wyatt nodded. Judge Elias Reed didn't want to lose one of his best. Asked a few of us to keep watch. The canyon fell quiet. The past had caught up and there was no outrunning it now. Riley neither reached for the paper nor pushed it away. She looked at Storm, at the bound men at the posse waiting. The raven called again from high overhead, circling once before vanishing into the blue. She had won, but the victory carried scars she would carry to her grave. And the old badge waited in Wyatt's hand, silent, patient, demanding an answer she had not yet spoken. 2 weeks had passed since Devil's Playground, and the desert had already begun to forget the blood on the rocks. Shadow Crest Ranch stood quiet under the Arizona twilight, the sun bleeding orange across Coyote Ridge, turning the sagebrush to gold and shadow. Riley Kane sat on the porch steps, elbows on her knees, a tin cup of coffee gone cold in her hands. The air carried the sharp, clean scent of cooling earth and distant piñon smoke, someone burning cedar far down the valley. She wore the same plain cotton shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, the right one stained faintly where the old wound had seeped through the bandage that morning. Her shoulder ached in the evening chill, a low, persistent throb that no amount of rest could quiet. The bullet from Sycamore Canyon had left its mark deep. Jace Calder's graze had only deepened the groove. She flexed her fingers, testing the grip, strong enough but slower than before. She would never draw as clean on the right again. That was the price she had paid, and she accepted it without complaint. In the corral, Storm moved slow circles Silver Coat, catching the last light like polished steel. He had filled out again the hollows under his ribs, smoothed by 2 weeks of good feed and quiet. He stopped near the fence, ears pricked, dark eyes fixed on her. Riley set the cup aside and rose. Her boots made soft thumps on the packed earth as she crossed to the rails. Storm lowered his head over the top pole. She reached up, palm flat against the warm curve of his neck. The mustang exhaled once long and slow nostrils flaring against her sleeve. She rested her forehead there, breathing him in the familiar smell of dust and horse and something wild that no corral could ever tame. "We're home," she murmured the words more to herself than to him. Hoofbeats sounded on the road, slow, deliberate. Riley straightened, but did not turn away from the corral. Luke Tanner rode up on a bay hat, pushed back a thick envelope tied to his saddle. He dismounted, boots hitting the ground with a soft puff of dust. "Evening, Mrs. Kane," he said, touching the brim. "Wyatt sent me. Said you'd want to see this sooner than later." Riley walked to the porch rail, leaning there while Luke climbed the steps. He handed her the envelope. She broke the seal without hurry. Inside were 2 documents, one confirming her return to limited active status as Special Territorial Marshal Jurisdiction across Arizona, but based at Shadow Crest. The second was a commission naming her official tracker for the valley, coordinating with Wyatt when needed. Judge Elias Reed's signature was bold at the bottom of both. Luke watched her read. "Judge seems keen to have you back. Wyatt says it's unprecedented." Riley folded the papers carefully. Silas Reed always favored unconventional solutions. Luke shifted his weight. "The town council approved Grant Harlan's proposal this morning. They want you on retainer tracking strays, rustlers, whatever comes up. Paid, of course. On your terms." Riley looked past him toward the ridge. The sky had deepened to indigo, first stars pricking through. She felt the pull of it, the old life, calling not as a ghost, but as part of her. She could refuse. Could burn the papers, keep the quiet routine of ranch work, and horse gentling let the valley find its own way. But the thought rang hollow now. The valley had seen her. Wyatt had seen her. Nora had kept her secret without a word, but secrets like that never stayed buried forever. "I'm considering it," she said at last. "On my terms. I won't abandon what I've built here, the ranch, the horses, this life. But maybe there's space for both halves of who I am." Luke nodded, relief plain on his young face. "The valley will be glad to hear that." He touched his hat again and mounted up, riding off into the gathering dark. Riley watched the dust settle behind him. She turned back to the corral. Storm had come closer to the fence, head low, waiting. She stepped through the rails and crossed the open ground to him. He met her halfway, muzzle brushing her shoulder. She placed both hands on his neck, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The porch light spilled warm from the cabin window. On the mantel inside, two things rested side by side: the silver star cleaned and polished, and the deed to Shadow Crest Ranch, the life she had built after Sycamore Canyon. For 8 years she had believed those two could not coexist. Widow and marshal, horse trainer and tracker, woman seeking peace and the one who once hunted the territory's worst. Now she understood the division had always been false. She had not undone the quiet life by riding out. She had completed it. The wind moved through Coyote Ridge, carrying the faint scent of sage and distant rain. Storm lifted his head ears, flicking toward the sound. Riley rested her cheek against his neck, eyes closed. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote yipped, once sharp, lonely, then gone. She did not move. The night deepened around Shadow Crest, and the ranch lights a single small glow against the vastness. Riley Kane, widow horse trainer Shadowstep, stood in the corral with her mustang whole at last, but carrying scars that would never fade. The story ended here, not in triumph, not in peace, but in the quiet acceptance of both. And under the wide Arizona sky, with Storm standing close, she knew the trails she had walked were not behind her. They were simply the ground she stood on now. The wind carried on, whispering through the ridge, and the stars watched silent and eternal. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blaze the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal/disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process. But every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work,